and welcome to our election special at Boom. We're calling our series US Elections Simplified, and we are asking really basic and simple questions. The focus really is on explanation. We are not looking at speculation or declaring any news, but it's been a long 24 hours in the United States, and we still have no winner. Let's talk about that and other topics with Maya Mirchandani. She's a senior fellow at ORF, an assistant professor at Ashoka University, and also a seasoned journalist and has spent several years covering elections in the United States. Welcome to Boom, Maya.
Thanks a lot, Venkatesh. Thank you.
Have we seen anything like this in the past 30 or 40 years? I mean, we're seeing in terms of turnout, counting disagreements, legal challenges, and so on.
I want to just say that in the years that I have covered an election, the last election I saw, which with this kind of contestation and controversy, probably was Florida. The 2000 election, the Bush-Gore election, in which Al Gore challenged the Florida count, and it had to go into the courts and be adjudicated upon because of the hanging chads and the butterfly ballots, where counting officials were forced to kind of determine the intent of the voter because something hadn't been pressed quite clearly in the ballot. And even that, I think, after a few days, it was decided that it would be a concession, and George Bush won that election. This election, I think, even breaks that convention and that norm, which is that it has gone to the courts in the past. Traditionally, US elections, networks have always called the states and the Electoral College towards a candidate based on early projections and a large percentage of the votes coming in, even if all are not counted. They've often projected these on leads. And normally the leads are so clear that before the end of the night, one candidate, the sort of losing candidate, comes out and concedes the election, and the winner takes it all at that point in time, so to speak. So consensus has been a huge part of the American political landscape. We do things with civility. They talk about we believe in consensus. We need to work together. It's bipartisan across the aisle, blah blah blah. And so the losing candidate concedes, and it sort of goes from there. I think if everyone was sort of watching this election and the run-up to this election closely, a lot of the commentary, in spite of what pollsters were saying and predicting in terms of a blue wave and a Biden wave, I mean, we saw, I think it was yesterday, Real Clear Politics had predicted over 300 electoral college seats for Joe Biden. But a lot of people, a lot of reporters on the ground were talking about the fact that this was going to be a really close election. And I think they really had the pulse of the people, not the pollsters. So because it's a close election, the mail-in vote has become really the sort of focus of attention right now. People have voted in the midst of a pandemic. A lot of people have voted early. The postal ballot, early voting, nearly 100 million Americans who have participated in the vote before election day. So what happens to those? That became a big controversy. And yes, the message was that there isn't going to be a clear winner on election night, and no one's going to concede the election, and this is going to be contested. And that's really exactly how it's happened. I think when Biden came out and first said that, it's the voters who decide, not the networks and not the Democrats or Republicans, he was sending a message that he's not ready to throw in the towel just yet.
Yes. And we'll get to what Trump said as well. But Maya, one of the things that I've noticed, and I think about every 4 years roughly, is the quirks of an American election from the perspective of an Indian election. I mean, there is no election commission that is going to declare the results. You have, various states having their own conventions, and ultimately, it seems it's the media, it's the big TV networks that declare a winner or call an election. And this time around, they've been unusually restrained.
That's right. In fact, I mean, I think there has been a determined effort by the US media, and I've been sort of flipping through their YouTube channels and their networks, whether it's Fox or CNN, doesn't really matter. They're only declaring states where almost 100% of the voting has been counted, and there is a clear, decisive sort of winner. They're very hesitant to call these too close to call states, and I think we've never seen a situation where there have been like 5 or 6 states that have been too close to call till the very end. I mean, as far as the Americans are concerned, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in election year, by 10 o'clock at night, everyone knows who the next president is, and networks kind of wrap up and go home. 6 o'clock in the morning, the anchors are still there, or they're back there in some cases. And I think that restraint is unusual. But the point that you made about how every state has its own set of rules. So in some states, mail-in votes will be accepted as long as they're postmarked on the 3rd of November. In some states, they'll be counted only if they arrive at the county office by the 3rd of November. Some states say that they can come in by the 3rd of November and we'll continue counting for a week later or 2 weeks later. Some say we count our votes and keep them ready to announce on election day. So there's no real clear system. There's no central architecture. It was about the states having their own autonomy, so to speak. And I find that baffling, because it's one thing to do that at a congressional level for a state election. It's another thing to do it at a presidential election, because this is a national election. And if there's no national guideline for how these elections are to be conducted, it's really quite confusing. And I mean, it's one thing, all Indians today are out there tweeting saying, why don't you borrow our election commission? Maybe they'll be able to help you out. We said this in 2000 when the Florida ballot also happened. We're like, you're using paper ballots, we use EVMs. Why don't you use an electric machine? It's much simpler. The votes can be tallied much faster. So, but that's the system. And the same thing with the Electoral College and the popular vote. Some can argue that it's a skewed system because it doesn't reflect the popular vote. Others say the popular vote is decided only by largely, like heavily populated areas. So what about representation for others who may not have it? But I mean, those are the intentions with which the American election system was designed. And I think, they agree to abide by it. It's just that this time around that, Trump has said he's going to go to the Supreme Court or go to the court. And he stacked up the court in his favor already before election day. So, it's going to be an interesting and a tense, I think, few days as well.
Yeah. We've seen the breakdown of consensus also from a post-truth perspective, given the fact-checking we do at Boom. Yeah. But it was also interesting, by the way, to see the networks calling out Trump's lies for what they are. Donald Trump tweeted, and then Twitter put in that label saying that this is not something that you can take as verified. And then he came out, President Trump came out and made a statement saying that he's not going to go down without a fight, without any basis. He said we won the election. So I mean, take us through how completely different from business as usual that is.
So I think, two things. One is that we've seen the big social media companies possibly realize from the lessons of 2016 and Cambridge Analytica about the way voters have been specifically micro-targeted through their social media pages, as well as how the absence of fact-checking on social media has allowed disinformation and deliberate misinformation about candidates to kind of spread like wildfire. To me, it's intriguing and somewhat upsetting as well to see social media companies suddenly want to flag misinformation or misleading tweets in the context of the US election, where so many other elections across the world have taken place where they haven't taken these steps. So there is clearly a vested, biased interest that they are displaying towards what is their own election versus, some other country in some other part of the world. But that aside, I think the fact that Donald Trump's reputation with American mainstream media or his tirades against those who are critical of him, calling them fake journalists and this is fake news and things like that, it's skewed the pitch. It's almost as though we're living in a propaganda age, and that one can argue we've always lived in a propaganda age, but I think the fact that we have automation, we have speed, we have the ability to amplify that kind of propaganda today at unprecedented scales and unprecedented volume. So, you say enough times at enough rallies that the postal ballot is a fraud and the Democrats are trying to steal the election, and you have a large number of people believing that to be the truth because, I mean, hey, who's reading the papers anymore? We're all getting our information from our social media feeds.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And one final question from India's perspective. India is obviously monitoring the situation closely. What does India have to gain or lose from a Trump or Biden presidency? Are there any broad contours that you can sketch, or is it a little too early? What is your perspective?
I think there's a couple of different angles to that. So, one is that broadly, the India US relationship has shown signs of some stability over the last maybe 15 years or so. The nuclear deal was really the benchmark on which, and the bed on which this relationship has subsequently moved. We have seen, what is the word, impetuousness, I guess, for want of a better word, from Donald Trump when it comes to things like, the issue of trade and bringing India into the GSP or waiving the GSP from Indian goods. I mean, we've seen that he's far less willing to accommodate India's own protectionist or nationalistic economic agenda. He wants his bang for the buck, and he's very clear that if he's not going to get it, he can come in and say, India is a great friend, but then he'll go back home and say something completely different. So I think impetuousness of the individual is one sort of complicated space. The flip side of that is that the Republicans aren't as vocal on issues of, human rights and civil liberties and things like that as the Democrats are. And that was one thing that many Indians were upset about with Kamala Harris and Pramila Jayapal and people like that. So they see a Trump presidency as being continually sort of non-interfering in domestic matters. That's an upside for the Indian state, certainly. But overall, I think the fact that, foreign policy, while it may operate on the premise of continuity, is also now operating at the whims of an individual. And I think that's always very difficult to navigate for diplomats because, one day America is in the Iran nuclear deal, one day America is out of it. How does that impact India's ties with Iran? Or what are the exceptions that we are going to be looking at? One day, things are all hunky-dory with China while we are dealing with Chinese on our borders. The other day, Trump is railing about trade with China. I think the fact that there's really no consistency, even if there's continuity in the State Department, there's no consistency in the statements made by the president. And I think the contradiction or the conflict between those two elements of US foreign policy can sometimes be difficult for states to engage with. Do you deal with the president who's made some outlandish statement, or do you feel secure in the fact that diplomats in the State Department are making sure the statement doesn't have any serious impact? Who do you deal with? And I think these are real questions. But, it is what it is. And if Biden wins, we may see significant shifts. We may not see significant shifts. If Trump wins, the same holds true. So I think for us, somebody told me yesterday that for everybody in the world, two elections matter, their own and the American. So we're at that stage. While it may not have an impact on us domestically, I think the whole world is sort of waiting for this election to be over and a winner to be announced. And, let's just live through the next 4 years and see what happens.
Yeah. And that's going to be at least a few more hours or a few more days.
At least, yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Maya, for your perspective.
Not at all. Pleasure to be on Boom Live. Thanks a lot.